The world would be better off without Russia. Not the land, not the people, but the system, the empire that dragged half of the world into its darkness for over a century. For decades, we were told that if Russia collapsed, the world would burn. But now that it's happening, something strange is unfolding. The world isn't collapsing, it's healing. Energy blackmail is failing. Europe is stronger. Ukraine is rising, and the regime that called itself a superpower is devouring itself from the inside. This isn't just a fall, it's a reset. And once you see what's being left behind and what's starting to emerge, you might just agree. The world really is better off without Russia. Here's why the map that you've been staring at your entire life has been lying to you. When you look at a world map, Russia appears as this massive unified giant stretching across 11 time zones. A single nation, a cohesive power. Wrong. Russia isn't a nation state like France or Japan. It's something far more dangerous. The last of the great land empires. A 16th century conquest project that never evolved, never modernized, and never learned to stop devouring everything around it. The whole thing started in 1552 with Ivan the Terrible. Yes, that's his actual title, when he conquered the Khanate of Kazan. Now, before this moment, Moscow was just another compact East Slavic principality. It was unremarkable, it was regional. But the fall of Kazan, that changed everything. For the first time, Moscow absorbed a non-Slavic country. Muslims, Tatars, an entirely different civilization. And Moscow didn't stop there. 4 years later, he took Astrakhan, securing control of the entire Volga River and opening the gates to Siberia and the Caspian Sea. This became the template. Conquer, extract, repeat. And here's the part that should terrify you. Within the borders of modern Russia today, there are nearly 200 distinct ethnic groups. Entire nations, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Sakha, Dagestan, each with their own languages, their own histories, and their own supposed dreams of freedom. Now, these aren't Russian regions, they're captive nations. And the wealth that they produce, well, you wouldn't believe where it actually goes. Let's talk about Sakha, also known as Yakutia. Now, this place is the size of India, not a typo. One Russian republic that's nearly as large as the entire Indian subcontinent. Now, imagine a region that produces 99% of Russia's diamonds and 25% of the world's total diamond supply. Gold, tin, coal, all pulled from the frozen ground in staggering quantities. By every measure, Sakha should be one of the wealthiest places on earth, but it's not. The infrastructure is primitive. Roads crumble. Hospitals lack basic equipment. Schools operate in buildings that should have been condemned decades ago. The local population, the indigenous Sakha people who have lived on this land for millennia, watch as diamonds worth billions are torn from beneath their feet. And where does that wealth go? Well, the environment is devastated by extraction operations that locals have no control over. Massive open-pit mines scar the permafrost. Toxic runoff poisons rivers. The land itself is being consumed. And the people who call it home have no voice in the process. Why? Because every ruble of profit vanishes into the federal budget in Moscow. The system is designed this way. It's not an accident or an oversight. It's colonialism, plain and simple. Except the colonizer and the colonized share the same legal border. Think of it like this. Sakha is the employee who generates millions for the company, but Moscow is the boss who keeps the entire paycheck and then tosses back just enough to keep the lights on. This isn't unique to Sakha. The same pattern plays out across every resource-rich region. Tyumen, Khanty-Mansi, Yamalo-Nenets. Now, these are regions that provide the oil and gas that keeps Russia's economy breathing. They're donor regions, meaning that they produce far more tax revenue than they ever get back. And they have zero say in how that money is spent. But here's where things get truly insane. In 2025, while Russia's war machine demanded more money, more weapons, more bodies, something called the budgetary scissors effect kicked in. Regional revenue stagnated while Moscow's war expenditures exploded. The very regions providing the lifeblood of Russia's economy, the ones sitting on oceans of oil and mountains of diamonds, started running deficits. Tyumen, deficit of 33.8 billion rubles. Yamalo-Nenets, deficit of 38 billion rubles. Now, these regions produce 60% of Russia's oil and 90% of its natural gas. And they're broke because Moscow is bleeding them dry to fund a war that doesn't benefit them, a military that doesn't protect them, and an elite class that doesn't even see them as human. In a world without Russia, without this vampiric center, The Republic of Sakha would be one of the wealthiest nations per capita on the planet. It would control its own resources, set its own environmental standards, and trade freely with Japan, South Korea, and China. But instead, it's a colony. And Sakha isn't the only one fighting to break free. Let's rewind to 1992. Now, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. The world was watching to see if the pieces would fall into chaos or find their footing. In Tatarstan, a powerhouse region in the heart of the Volga, something remarkable happened. The people held a referendum. The simple question was, should Tatarstan be a sovereign state? 62% said yes. That's not a slim majority. That's a landslide. Nearly 2/3 of voters declared that they wanted to be a sovereign nation and a subject of international law. They drafted their own constitution. They negotiated a power-sharing treaty with Moscow that gave them unprecedented autonomy. For a brief moment, Tatarstan was almost free. But then came Vladimir Putin. One by one, he dismantled Tatarstan's autonomy. The vertical of power crushed the republic's aspirations. Regional legislation was forced into line with federal law. The dream of sovereignty was buried under Kremlin decrees. Today, Tatarstan's leaders are appointed. They're not elected. Their constitution is meaningless, and their autonomy is a memory. But the desire for freedom, that never dies. And if you think Tatarstan had it bad, let me tell you what happened in the Caucasus. The Circassian people have a word for what Russia did to them: genocide. Between 1817 and 1864, Russian forces waged a campaign of extermination in the North Caucasus. The numbers are staggering and sickening. 95 to 97% of the Circassian population was either killed outright or deported in what historians now recognize as one of history's most successful, if you can call it that, ethnic cleansings. Emperor Alexander II didn't hide the goal. Official documents from the era describe the plan to utterly force out the indigenous population to make room for Russian settlers. Villages were burned to ash. Families were marched into the mountains in winter, left to freeze and to starve. Entire communities were loaded onto plague-infected ships and then sent to the Ottoman Empire. Thousands died before the ships even reached port. The survivors scattered across the Middle East. Today, there are more Circassians living in diaspora than in their ancestral homeland. Syria, Jordan, Turkey. These places hold larger Circassian populations than the North Caucasus itself. And today, well, the Russian government officially denies that it ever happened. They call it a mass migration. They refuse to acknowledge the genocide, refuse to apologize, and continue to exercise brutal control over what's left of the region. If you try to commemorate the genocide publicly in Russia, well, you risk arrest. In 2018, Russia passed an education law that should have made global headlines, but barely registered. The law made the teaching of minority languages non-compulsory. Again, non-compulsory. This wasn't just policy. It was cultural extermination in slow motion. Languages like Tatar, Udmurt, and Bashkir, ancient tongues spoken for over 1,000 years, suddenly now are optional, secondary, irrelevant. When a state declares that one language, one culture, and one history are state-forming, it renders every other identity invisible. It's the final stage of empire, erasing the proof that other nations ever even existed. But here's the twist that no one talks about. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, every expert, every analyst, every talking head on television warned of the same thing: chaos, failed states, nuclear disaster, economic ruin. They pointed to the Balkans. They invoked the specter of civil war. And then the Balkan states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, did something that no one expected. They thrived. Since 2000, GDP per capita has doubled in all three Baltic nations. In Lithuania, it's nearly tripled. Estonia has become one of the most digitally advanced societies on Earth, leading the world in e-governance and innovation. These were repressed Soviet backwaters just 3 decades ago, but today, they're proof that freedom actually works. But what about the nukes? Now, this is the question that always comes up. What happens to Russia's 5,500 nuclear warheads if the country breaks apart? It's a fair question, and history has already answered it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan all inherited nuclear arsenals. Ukraine alone became the 3rd largest nuclear power on Earth overnight. The world faced the exact same fear: loose nukes, rogue states, nuclear terrorism. And then something remarkable happened. Through a program called None Lugar, the international community worked with these newly independent states to safely decommission and consolidate every single warhead. Ukraine gave up its nukes. Belarus gave up its nukes. Kazakhstan gave up its nukes. All peacefully, and all successfully. The real nuclear danger today isn't the possibility of a post-imperial Russia. It's the current imperial Russia. Moscow uses its nuclear arsenal as a shield to commit atrocities. It practices nuclear signaling, threatening the world to prevent anyone from stopping its invasions. Russia violated the security guarantees of the Budapest Memorandum when it invaded Ukraine. It breached the INF Treaty by developing prohibited cruise missiles. The centralized Russian state is the threat. But let's talk about what's really killing the empire: money. Empires are expensive. They require a massive secret police apparatus, a bloated, inefficient military, loyalty payments to regional strongmen, propaganda networks, surveillance systems. For 2 decades, high oil prices let Russia afford all of this. But the math is changing. By 2024, Russia's economy entered what economists call an overheating phase. Unemployment dropped to just 2%, which sounds good until you realize that it means that there are no workers left. The labor pool is exhausted. Every factory, every construction site, every service sector business is desperately short-staffed. Russia's defense spending hit 13.5 trillion rubles in 2025. That's the largest military budget in the country's modern history, larger than education, healthcare, and infrastructure combined. But the civilian economy? Stagnating, crumbling, gasping for air. Interest rates spiked. Inflation surged past 7%. The ruble weakened. And while Moscow poured money into tanks and artillery shells, Russian families watched their purchasing power evaporate. The economy isn't growing. It's being cannibalized to feed the war machine. And here's the part that should worry Moscow the most: the brain drain. Since the invasion of Ukraine, nearly 800,000 and 900,000 Russians have fled the country. Now, these aren't random people. They're the best and the brightest. IT specialists, scientists, engineers, doctors, the exact people that you need to build a modern economy. By the end of 2024, Russian companies were already short about 2.2 million workers. An empire that can't innovate, that's losing its smartest minds, and that's running out of bodies to exploit can only survive one way: through theft and coercion. And naturally, the cost of coercion exceeds the value of theft. Now here's the part that might surprise you. The biggest winners in a world without the Russian Empire might be the ethnic Russians themselves. For 500 years, Russians have been the primary tools and the primary victims of their own state. They've been sent to die in wars for the greater glory of an empire that treats them as disposable. They've been denied the development of a true civil society, kept as subjects instead of citizens. The imperial mission has been a parasite on the Russian soul. Let me take you back to 1470. In the city of Novgorod, something unusual existed: a proto-democratic republic. The Novgorod Republic was governed by the Vish, a popular assembly where citizens could elect and dismiss their leaders. It was a merchant state, deeply connected to Europe through the Hanseatic League, thriving on trade and cooperation. And it was the opposite of everything that Moscow represented. So Moscow crushed it. Ivan III annexed Novgorod. He destroyed the Vichy and imposed autocratic rule. The city's unique traditions, its contracts, freedoms, its European orientation, all erased. Novgorod became just another subject territory. Imagine if that spirit still survived. Imagine a Russia rooted in Novgorod's legacy instead of Moscow's tyranny. A little Russia, a Russia that isn't trying to dominate Eurasia, would be a better Russia. It would be a nation that values its poets and scientists more than its tanks and missiles. A country that could finally join the European family as an equal democratic partner. Without the weight of the empire, Russians could breathe. The fall of nations isn't a tragedy. It's a natural rhythm of history. Empires don't last. They can't. The British Empire fell, the French Empire fell, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Soviet, all gone. And the world didn't end. In most cases, it got better. India is better off without British rule. Ireland, better off independent. The Czech Republic is thriving without Vienna's grip. The Russian Federation is a 19th century ghost that haunts a 21st century world. It's a system built on suppression, extraction, violence. It treats its borders as flexible and people as disposable. Right now, we're watching the cracks spread. The economic deficits, the military failures in Ukraine, the cultural resistance in the republics, the exodus of the young and talented. This isn't just a country in decline, it's an empire in its final act. And when it finally falls, what rises in its place won't be chaos. It'll be voices. The wealth of the Ural Mountains will stay in the Urals. A child in Kazan will learn their mother tongue without being labeled as a separatist. Siberian cities can trade freely with the Pacific Rim. Tatarstan will govern itself, and Sakha will control its diamonds. Now, this transition won't be easy, but it's necessary, because the logic of decolonization must finally reach the heart of Eurasia. The lines on the map are already shifting. The empire is fading. And for the millions of people living within those borders, this isn't the end of a country. It's the beginning of a future. So what do you think? Is the world ready for a Russia that isn't an empire? Or will the old guard fight to the bitter end, dragging everyone down with them? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to see how other empires are crumbling in real time, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next.